Sport protesting. What we are going to cover: history of sports protesting, the problem, research on sport protesting, resolving recommendations.
Throughout history, there have been many sports protests. On our slides, we touch on a few that have to do with war protests, racial discrimination, and more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the first sports protests we talk about is in 1968. They call it the Fist of Fury because of Tommy Smith and John Carlos silently protesting during the Olympic medal ceremony by bowing their heads and raising their fists. Later on with protests against racial discrimination, we have the Syracuse 8 from the Syracuse 1970 football team and how they were not being treated racially equal. And after this, it opened up and made healthcare better and stronger academic support for all of their student athletes. Later on, we have the death of Trayvon Martin. This opened so many eyes amongst the U.S. The Miami Heat started a protest by wearing hoodies before their games. Following this, by a couple of years, we have a few protests in the remembrance of Michael Brown in Ferguson with the Don't Shoot campaign by a Knox College basketball player and some players on the St. Louis Rams, now known as the LA Rams. There are many protests that happen in sports. The one that has seen most backlash is the one with Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem. He did this because he didn't want to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and other people of color. He was looking at this bigger than just the game of football. He was looking at this about life and how we are in the U.S. Next up, we are going to talk about some problems that happen with sports protesting.
Why does sport protesting occur? Sports are a way to represent patriotism and nationalism, so athletes will normally play for the flag or the country. Athletes use their fame to address political issues by attracting focus to issues that are prevalent in their society, such as racism, racial profiling, sexism, etc. They show their anger to the nation by turning their back on the flag to symbolize how the country turned their back on them. They grab attention because they are looked up to, but nonetheless, it creates controversy. It raises awareness to the fact that the country they play for is not always just and fair. It also shows how influential athletes can be and how much power they hold in society. For example, Kaepernick got so much media coverage for kneeling during the national anthem and starting that trend. But even though he was met with a lot of controversy across the nation, his message was still delivered.
As we've mentioned, a significant amount of sports protests, both historically and today, have been started by athletes of color speaking out against large-scale racial discrimination. So in 2016, black people made up 15% of the U.S. population roughly, and around 40% of fatal police shootings. Black athletes are also fined at significantly higher frequencies and dollar amounts for unsportsmanlike offenses than white athletes. Black athletes are subject to 15% higher fines for, quote, aggressive penalties, unquote, than white athletes, according to one paper published in 2016. These are just a few examples of empirically supported racial discrimination, both inside and outside the realm of sports, that are both catalysts for and subjects of sports protests. Finally, I'd like to call some attention to how the subject of sports protesting is even framed in the mainstream media and political discourse. Specifically looking at Colin Kaepernick, we find that the rhetoric actually ignores the social concerns that are being voiced by these athletes. Kaepernick's accusers largely suggested that his protest was unpatriotic and un-American, while his defenders actually reframed the act as patriotic. He was expressing his freedom of speech, and this act should be inoffensive, or at the very least, a constitutionally granted individual right. However, both of these framing tactics actually ignore the social concerns that protesters like Kaepernick are trying to address. The focus of the mainstream media, and therefore the public, falls on the individual, instead of the larger conversation that these individuals are trying to engage us with. Namely, what structural changes can be made to the institutions inside and outside of sports that will reduce inequality? We'll take a look at some of these suggestions next.
Other published research implies the existence of racial stereotypes across sports. More specifically, the data concludes that in baseball, blacks are overrepresented in outfield positions, making up approximately 61.7% of players, while being underrepresented in infield positions, making up around 19.6% of players. A similar pattern is evident in football, where blacks are overrepresented as defensive backs, running backs, and wide receivers, making up about 2/3 of the players. They are underrepresented as quarterbacks, kicking specialists, centers, and guards. Scholars propose a number of reasons why this might be the case, one of which being that outfielders in baseball are not required to be as strategic and are not in the position to be decision makers and leaders. Infielders carry this burden much more prominently, and prejudice on the side of coaches could be a factor in the reluctance to have blacks occupy these positions. This is also true for football, where positions like the quarterback require more strategy and critical ability. It's also noted that whites dominate coaching and managerial positions across sports in general, causing blacks to be underrepresented in leadership roles. Clearly, stereotyping is evident in the culture of sports in general and is a determining factor in differential treatment. Also in this study, the researcher finds that despite black players on average performing better in infield and outfield positions, they are still paid less than their white counterparts in both positions.
In order to resolve these issues, there needs to be legislative action on both the federal and state level. More laws need to be implemented that protect marginalized communities in society, and laws that prevent discrimination in the housing and employment market are key. These markets report high level of racial disparities and continually discriminate due to race. Because of this, there are large gaps in the achievement level among different races, most notably blacks and whites. In addition to legislative action, there needs to be criminal justice reform. One of the key subjects of sports protesting is to bring awareness and change to racial injustice in America, specifically police brutality. Like the housing and employment market, there are racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Higher amounts of blacks are being killed by the police, and a staggering amount are being convicted and imprisoned at a higher rate than whites. Continuing the widespread access to cam footage of police interactions would increase the overall accountability for the police departments, as well as police retraining with a focus on racial sensitivity. These changes could prove to be beneficial. Outreach programs are also imperative in resolving such issues. Programs that provide assistance to those in need and the youth would be actively addressing the issues and concerns athletes often protest against, such as poverty, the education achievement gap, and racial injustice. Colin Kaepernick's Know Your Rights program is a key example of that. He raises money for higher level education attainment, self-improvement and empowerment, and as well as how to interact with the police. Finally, awareness. How can sport protesting affect racial attitudes? How does the status and wealth of the athletes impact their ability to protest or be activists? Should athletic organizations have a say in athletes protesting? Why or why not? How do the athletic organizations such as the NFL and NBA perpetuate racial stereotypes?